My name is Phil Boszkowski, and today I'm going to talk about classical conditioning, which was a topic in my AP Psych class this year. The reason I'm going to talk about it is because a lot of my friends and people I know who took AP Psychology had a problem understanding classical conditioning and how to recognize it in certain situation and questions their teachers or instructors would give them on a test or a quiz. Now, what is classical conditioning? So the fancy definition for classical conditioning is basically a neutral stimuli associated uh, when a neutral stimuli is paired with a meaningful stimuli or an event that eventually takes a meaning for itself. Now I know what you're thinking. What did this guy just say? This is too complicated, and I totally agree. I don't like that definition either. So the definition I go by and I use when I explain classical conditioning is basically whenever you see an object or a stimuli around you and you associate that object or stimuli with something you experienced or felt earlier in your life, that is classical conditioning. So, for example, if you see a blanket and you feel this sense of comfort and joy, that sense of comfort and joy you associate the blanket with the sense of comfort and joy, and that association is basically classical conditioning because the blanket is just a normal object in your home, but you associate that object with something that you felt previously in your life, and that is classical conditioning. The person who discovered classical conditioning, his name was Ivan Pavlov, and he was a doctor in Russia, and he found classical conditioning by observing his dog salivating every time the dog would see his bowl of food. And what Pavlov asked himself was whether his dog would salivate to any other object Pavlov would show to him. And after he did a series of experiments, he found that actually that was the case. That could be the case. And what he did is basically the Pavlov dog experiment that you may or may not heard of is a pretty it's a pretty famous experiment. He basically took a tuning fork and started hitting the tuning fork before he would give him the bowl of food, and after a certain amount of time, every time he would hit the tuning fork, the dog would start to salivate, and that explained classical conditioning. So before the dog associated the sound of the tuning fork with the food, he would not salivate when he heard the tuning fork. But after a certain amount of time, when he saw that every time the doctor would hit the tuning fork, food will after a certain amount of time food will come to him, he started associating the food with the tuning fork, which made him salivate. Now, I know a lot of times teachers, instructors would give you situation and questions where they give you a sentence and you have to analyze the sentence and distinguish all the parts of classical conditioning in it. So here is an example. So after Mary watched the scary movie Jaws, she would, if after Mary watched the scary movie Jaws, uh, every time, oh my god, so bad. Every time, every time she, I'm sorry about my spelling, would hear the Dust Song, she would start to feel anxious and scared. And okay, so in this sentence there's classical conditioning, but the problem is how do you distinguish all the parts? Now there are 5 parts of classical conditioning, as you may already know. There is the neutral stimuli that I mentioned before. Oh, sorry. I'm gonna put this in black. Neutral stimuli. There is the unconditioned stimuli, the unconditioned response, the conditioned stimuli, and the conditioned response. These are the 5 elements of classical conditioning. Now, the neutral stimulus is basically the object that does not make any sense before some activity happens. So when you analyze a question, try to be as objective as possible, because you have to you can associate some feelings you have with the things that are happening in the sentence. So look at it as objectively as possible. So when you look at the sentence and you go, after Mary watched the scary movie Jaws, every time she would hear the Dust Song, she would start. Oh, sorry, my bad. Okay. She would start to feel that start. She would start to feel anxious and scared. So basically, what we're saying is, so when you look at the whole example, you're going, okay, what here is the neutral stimulus? What's the stimulus, this object that is not associated with anything before the activity happens. And when you ask that questions and when you go through the lines, you see here the song. The song, the is not is basically does not associate anything before you watch the movie, because the song is the same as any other song or any other short melody. So that is the neutral stimulus. If you when you find the object stimulus that is not associated with anything before the activity happens, before something happens, that is the neutral stimulus. Then you go to the unconditioned stimulus, which is basically the activity that's going on, the thing that's happening. So after Mary watched the scary movie Jaws, so she's watching the scary movie Jaws. So the unconditioned stimulus in this case is the scary movie. So the scary movie is the unconditioned stimulus in this classical conditioning experiment. So that's the activity happening, so that's the unconditioned stimulus. Now, the response to this, when you see unconditioned response, the response, like we all know what response is. Something happens, you have a response to it. So when you watch a scary movie, you feel fear, anxiety, agitation. When you watch a comedy, you feel happiness, laughter, joy. So in this case, the unconditioned response is fear and anxiety Mary feels when watching the movie, when anyone watches the movie. So now we've distinguished all the first three parts of the unconditioned, the classical conditioned experiment. So now the conditioned stimulus. The conditioned stimulus is basically when you read the sentence, you go, when every time she would hear the dust song, she would start to feel anxious and scared. So anytime you want to distinguish the conditioned stimulus and the conditioned response, always think what's the neutral stimulus and what's the unconditioned response, because the conditioned stimulus in this case is the dust song. Like in the Pavlov dog experiment, the tuning fork, when you hit the tuning fork, when the dog heard the sound of the tuning fork, he would start to salivate because he associated the tuning fork with food. And that's the case here. You start to associate the dust song with something bad is going to happen. You start to feel scared because when you hear the dust song, you remember the shark attacking the people and attacking the boats in the movie. So the conditioned stimulus in the dust song and the response to the dust song, the dust song, is basically anxiety and fear. Fear, anxiety. Never mind. Either way. So as you can see, this little pattern that emerges here. So red. So here, neutral stimuli goes into the conditioned stimuli, and the unconditioned response turns into the conditioned response. And I think this is very good when you're analyzing a sentence, because if you find the neutral stimuli and you find the unconditioned response, you basically already found the conditioned stimuli and the conditioned response. So the dust song was a neutral object in the movie. When you watch the movie, you feel scared. Because you felt scared and the sound was associated with that movie, was in that movie, now the sound, now you associate that fear, that feeling of fear and anxiety, you now associate it with every element in that movie, like the song. So every time you hear the song, you feel fear and anxiety. So whenever you're analyzing questions like this, always try to find the neutral stimuli and the unconditioned response. When you find these two elements, then you can easily find the conditioned stimulus and the conditioned response, and always be as objective as possible in order to ask the right questions and the series of questions you need to distinguish all the parts in the classical conditioned experiment or example. So I hope this was helpful. I hope I shed some light on how to approach these problems and how to find all the elements. Practice makes perfect. Always practice these questions. Find examples in your test books, in your site books, and try to do as many examples as possible in order to get the hang of it and find all the elements easily as possible. So thank you guys. I hope this was helpful. Subscribe if you want to see more. Go to my write in the comments if I need to change anything or put anything else if I made any mistakes, so I know not to make them in the future. Thank you guys, and I'll see you next time.